I think it's interesting to attempt to classify and relate the various kinds of illusions that stand between us and that presupposed naked, radiant truth. that has more or less driven the engines of Western philosophy since Plato. Of course, the great victory of modernity is to disabuse ourselves of such naive notions, but they die hard, I think. Ralph mentioned my latest book, and I don't intend to talk about the book particularly, but in the book I quote the only piece of poetry in the whole thing, not written by me. I now see that I seem to have lost it. Oh no, here it comes up. But it relates to this on many, many levels, this question of illusion and the relationship of the self to the real and where the world falls in that equation and the limits of knowledge and all that other good psychedelic stuff that needs to be considered. The quote is from Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov, and if you don't know this book, you should. It is without doubt one of the funniest books in the English language, and it takes the form of a very long poem and then the commentary upon this poem. The poem is written by a character that Nabokov creates named John Shade, and the part that I want to call to your attention this evening runs like this. That rare phenomenon, the iridule, when, beautiful and strange, in a bright sky above a mountain range, one opal cloudlet in an oval form reflects the rainbow of a thunderstorm which in a distant valley has been staged, for we are most artistically caged. Now, this is a very strange piece of poetry. This is not like even Wallace Stevens at his most obscure. In the first place, this word, the iridule, you won't find this word in any dictionary, and yet I sensed that this is obviously the word for this phenomenon. I know what he's talking about. I have seen this opal cloudlet in an oval form, which reflects the rainbow of a thunderstorm in a distant place. We're in the realm of mirage, and nature as mirage, and nature as mirrored labyrinth. And then the final point, and I'll go through all this in the course of talking to you, but the final line about being artistically caged, this is, I think, where the psychedelics come in, because psychedelics allow one to pierce beyond the veil of cultural illusion, beyond the linguistic momentum of what has been handed on. The faith of Tantra and magic and psychedelics is that the apparent intransigent appearance of the world can somehow be overcome by an act of magic. I used to collect Tibetan thangkas, and the texts which go with some of these thangkas, I remember one in particular which, coming out of the Tibetan, the translation was, all things being reversed, the great Hla, the great God, appears instantly. You see, the precondition for magic is the reversal of causality somehow. And as moderns, we have grown to give great credence, I think, to the idea that the world is largely a linguistic structure, largely created through the participation of the observer. But we have not been able to take that perception and turn it into a technology. Instead, we are still driven by the blind momentum of atomic structure. Who was it who said the atoms blindly run? And then I think it was Whitehead who said, yes, but within the body they blindly run according to the body's plan. You see, what I think we're dealing with are patterns and then the indeterminate dimensions between patterns. And it's in those indeterminate places, within the interstices of reality, that the observer is able to establish him or herself and then model back the world. The reason I wanted to talk about a taxonomy of illusion was because I thought it was important to relate the various styles of hyperseeing, non-seeing, and misseeing together, because I think that the heuristic consequences of doing that are to realize just how shifting the sands are upon which the ontological edifice of Western thinking rests. I mean, that's always the point, you see, to deconstruct Western civilization, because Western civilization, the toxic consequences are now clear for everyone to see. So the first category or grand family of illusions which we would put into our taxonomic key would be social illusions. And when later we can argue this, but at this point in the discussion, illusion is / delusion. So the great social illusions, delusions, are sexism, racism, xenophobia, egoism, classism. The world is riddled and ruled by these social illusions, and no one is free of them. And so they constitute one broad category. I might just mention as an aside, a book which was very influential on me, and I never heard anybody else ever mention it, was a book by Rockcliffe called Illusions and Delusions of the Supernatural and the Occult. This was a 19th century book which I, as a kid, got in a Dover reprint. And it was in a wonderful era where the study of anomalies was still young, and so this book had everything poured in together, from Mesmer's ectoplasm to people who had tumors that they carried around in wheelbarrows, to birds that did advanced arithmetic, so forth and so on. And it was a very, very much from the point of view of Victorian rationalism. And it also mentioned psychedelics. It was what it really was a category of edges, and or a catalog of edges, I'm sorry. And it's only then in the subsequent 35 years that Wunderkamera approach to illusion, and I assume you all know what I mean by that. I'm referring to the era before the rise of Linnaean natural science, when naturalists would simply fill cabinets with anomalous, fascinating, and strange objects. So the tarantulas might be mixed in with the chambered nautiluses, which might be stirred into the Zuni fetishes, which might be next to the something else. Then later, these wunderkameras, these curiosity cabinets, as we would call them in English, gave way to Linnaean taxonomy. In the same way, over the past 100 years, I think the study of illusion and anomaly has attempted to rationalize itself. Spatial illusions are an entirely different family of illusory phenomena, and we all have encountered at some level, I imagine, the specially constructed environments that occur in behavioral psychology labs that trick you into thinking that the person in the foreground is smaller than the person in the background, and so forth and so on. These kinds of illusions are probably fairly trivial, except that they address perception. And when we get to psychedelics as a source of illusion, this is more important. Another of the great family of illusions are, in thinking about them, I called them ontological illusions, illusions of states of being, which may or may not, in fact, be reflected in reality. UFOs, Bigfoot, crop circles, the entire panoply of poltergeist phenomena, and this sort of thing, ontological illusions. And these are very interesting. I mean, one could give time to this alone, because there are persistent ontological illusions in the human sensorium, such as angels, elves, demons, jinns, afrits, nixies, and sprites, that crowd. And there are ontological illusions that seem somehow tied to the evolving modalities of the group mind. UFOs are an obvious example. I mean, aside from the fact that people have occasionally seen strange things in the sky, the UFO archetype really emerges in the late 40s with the Rainier lights, and then a whole set of taxonomic features of this particular brand of illusion coalesce. The silvery discs, the alien denizens with the cat eyes and the rubbery flesh, those same guys who give you unscheduled proctological examinations in the middle of the night. But notice that particular taxonomic feature has been added recently through the assiduously careful scientific research of Strieber and company. So these things are a cattle mutilation is an interesting one, very confined in time and space. The crop circle thing, similarly. It's not that there aren't crop circles, but that what we have is essentially a pattern in an English wheat field, but then radiating out from that are the illusions of those who cast their gaze upon it, those who proclaim it, telluric communication or particle beam research carried on by the Air Force, or in one version it was supposed that a particular crop circle had been decoded, found to be a lost Sumerian language, which when decoded said basically, "Don't stop here." It was essentially a no parking zone for time machines. They were saying, this entire century, just maintain speed and, do not stop. Psychedelic illusions. Again, this is a related category but different from these ontological illusions. By illusion, I mean that these are confrontations with phenomena, an apparently subjective ground and an assumed rational observer, where then there is a more than ordinary amount of ambiguity. I mean, most of reality is illusory. It's just that we do each other the courtesy of not pointing this out. Actually you trace a very thin data path through the world, and most of what we assume without question, we have very little evidence for. I mean, something as simple as, like that Mount Everest is the highest mountain in the world. Well, first of all, very few people have ever seen it. I saw it, and because I saw it from a distance of about 500 miles, it looked quite small, and my own testimony as to whether it was the highest mountain in the world would be fairly unreliable. And besides, what does that mean anyhow, and how the hell do you figure it out? I mean, here we have one mountain in the Himalayas and another in Bolivia, and you're telling me you know which is the higher mountain? It must rest on a whole bunch of weird and fishy assumptions resting on even shakier data. So, and that's just the question of the highest mountain in the world. Give or, leave alone the state of your lover's heart, or your banker's for that matter.